What's going on, digital wildcatters? Welcome to another week of Big Digital Energy. We've been out for the last couple weeks. Chuck was traveling across
Europa.
How was that?
So we did. My three kids couldn't agree on where to go, so I finally just said, "Pick a city." Kelly, I want to go to Berlin. Charlie, I want to go to Barcelona. Sarah, I want to go to Madrid. So we went Berlin, Barcelona, Madrid, and then for good measure, I went to the travel agent. I'm like, all right, how much do flights cost? Because I just worked backwards, cheapest flights back to the United States. Well, they were all about the same. And the travel agent was like, well, why don't Lisbon's kind of close. Let's check. Lisbon saved me $4,000 on flights back. So we went to Lisbon as well.
That's why you need a travel agent. I never understood the value propositions of travel agents until I was trying to plan a vacation for me and the family a few weeks ago. And I'm like, this is a pain in the ass. Like, I'm getting anxiety just thinking about this. So you need a good travel agent.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about being over in Europe is that heat wave was real. I mean,
You're from Houston, Texas.
I know. And Houston, Texas has the greatest concentration of air conditioning, I think, on the planet. Our hotel was blowing about 81, 82 degrees.
Oh, geez.
And I went down to the front desk, and this was in Berlin. And I have no concept of German. I mean, it makes no sense. It sounds like barking. Spanish, I kind of fake my way through, pick up a word here or there. But anyway, I just went down. Fortunately, most of the Germans speak it. I went down and I said, hey, our AC's broken. And they said, no, that's just all our AC can do.
It's not broken.
Madrid hit 106 on the internal. So,
well, GW said you had good city choices, and GW is a man of culture. So
yes, there we go.
It sounds like you got his approval.
So the last thing on the trip, just real quick, I'm going to mispronounce it. It's called Ahabra. And what that was is when the Muslims controlled Spain from, call it 700 AD to 1300 AD, somewhere in there, they built this palace. And it's the greatest preserved Moorish architecture out there, because when King Charles took back over Spain for the Christians, he just left it. So, I mean, he didn't tear it down. He didn't change it. He just added on. So it was really cool, because the history of this place is literally Christopher Columbus in this room signed the agreement to come to the New World. So I stood in that room.
That's
and it
cool.
it is a Muslim palace. And then it fell into disrepair. And literally Washington Irving, who wrote Ichabod Crane, he was squatting there back in the 19th century, writing a book with all these other homeless people. And finally, in about 1900, the Spanish government went, holy cow, this is like the greatest thing on the planet. And they've restored it and made it a national monument. But supposedly Napoleon's guys were going to blow it up, because that's what Napoleon did. He conquered an area, blew everything up, and they had it all hooked up with dynamites, and somebody cut the wire, and they couldn't figure out what happened. So they didn't blow it up, and they had to get out. So that's the reason it's here today. But it was very, very cool.
There's your History 101.
There you go on BDE. So while I was gone in Europe, Inflation Reduction Act, which I guess is Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer's version of Build Back Better Light, that came out. And, is it going to reduce inflation? Who knows?
Let's preface this conversation first that you or I haven't combed through the bill. We don't know exactly what's all in it. I don't understand why it's called the Inflation Reduction Act when you're spending billions of dollars. I thought we learned that our poor monetary policy is what has got us in an environment of high inflation. But that's besides the fact. A lot of people on Twitter that are involved in climate and passionate about that are celebrating this. It sounded like there's a lot of energy infrastructure, things with renewables and utilities, electric vehicles, things of that nature.
So I did
you get to dive in?
I did read a little bit of this, and we need Oilfield Rando to read the bill and produce one of his summaries on it. But because the hard thing about reading these acts is they go and they modify the tax code. So it says, it doesn't say, hey, here's the provision we're putting in. It says, in this section of the tax code, change the word is to aren't or whatever. And you have to go trace it back. But I read from a law firm, just a summary, there's about $400 billion allocated to renewables. And what it does is it extends the solar investment tax credit for 10 more years. And they have, within that provision, there's a 30% investment tax credit. I'm not exactly sure what that means. There's also a production tax credit of 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour that comes along with it. You and I have talked in the past. I get pitched renewable deals all the time where the premise is, hey, if you put up 10, you get 10 back in tax credits over time. So you break even. And then if the project makes any money, that's where you get your return. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how that math works. And we'll get an expert on either my podcast or to come on BDE so we can talk about it and learn about it. But that kind of feels like consistent with what I've seen deals pitches on. We're going to build renewables via the tax code in effect for free.
Yeah, and I mean, I know it included a lot of things like heat pumps for homes, which are kind of a big deal. A lot of people are talking about heat pumps lately online and the efficiencies that they can bring. And so lots of stuff in there around hydrogen, EVs. I think
there's some geothermal stuff in there.
Geothermal stuff, which, you know, the week before this, I saw $160 million dedicated to geothermal, which I had tweeted kind of, you know, Department of Energy had tweeted it out. And I'm like, 160 million is not shit when you're talking about drilling wells. I mean, what $160 million get you guys on CapEx at Kane? I mean, you're drilling, you know, 15 wells maybe with that. And but
160 million got us a big loss on 100,000 acres in the southern Midland Basin, but that's another story.
But actually, Tim Latimer, CEO of Fervo Energy, which is one of the leading geothermal companies, replied to me, and he actually had some good insight there. He said, you know, it may not be a ton, but it's more than geothermal's ever got before from the feds. And he's like, and typically there's a 5-to-1 ratio of private dollars to government funding. And so he said that was the case for Fervo. So ultimately, you know, $160 million of government money can lead to $500 million in private capital. So lots of, you know, my thing is, you know, at the beginning of this, kind of took a dig at it, saying, I don't know how this reduces inflation. But, you know, my thought personally has always been that I'd be happy to pay taxes if it goes towards education, healthcare, and energy infrastructure. You know, it's always the other bullshit that I don't want to pay. Like, I don't want to pay taxes to police the world or anything like that. And so for spending money on energy infrastructure, I think that's typically a good thing. Now, I know a lot of grift comes into the space when you have free money flowing around, but you know, it's not something that I'm mad at that we're spending money on it.
So I had Campbell Faulkner on the podcast. It's 2 podcasts ago, so about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we talked about the grid, talked about ERCOT in the state of Texas. And his description was we just kind of sleepwalked into the problems we have. And basically, to summarize what he was saying is the grid in the state of Texas, you get paid for producing energy.
Yeah.
That's it. So you supply some energy to the grid, some electricity, boom, you get paid for it. Well, what happened is you had, in effect, the tax code build these renewables. And so they, in effect, put electricity on the grid for just their operating costs, not necessarily the payback on the CapEx, which is fine. That leads to cheap consumer electricity. It also leads to unreliability because as we've seen, there are days when the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine. And so we just kind of sleptwalked into this grid that a third of the nameplate capacity is renewables, and we're having the reliability problems we have. My worry here is twofold. It's one, we go build a bunch more renewables. Are we going to have a less reliable grid without educating about it? I mean, we may make the decision that, hey, we got to get rid of CO2. It's so bad. We're going to use renewables, but just, hey, so going forward, we're going to have a less reliable grid. And then two, this kind of defeats the argument I always hear that renewables are so much more cost effective. Why do you need this if they are?
Well, I can't remember if we talked about this on the show a few weeks ago or if you and I talked about it in a private conversation, but the issue that I have with the renewables crowd is that when they talk about the economics of renewables, they always talk about it in silos, and they say, oh, well, renewable power is cheaper. And this is the same thing that happened in oil and gas with half cycle economics, and saying, oh, well, this well does a 40% IRR if you back out land costs, G&A, and
interest.
And it's just not a holistic way of talking about the economics and the finances. And on Twitter specifically, people they won't hear you out when you say that, because they're like, oh, you're just an oil and gas boy. I'm like, we were on Twitter back in 2018, 2019, calling out all the shit in oil and gas, whether it came to type curves, half cycle economics, things of that nature. And if you think that there's not going to be grift in renewables, you're wet behind the ears. And I think that when you look at these projects, you need to look at it from end to end. Hey, what are you going to have for backup power generation? That's something that we haven't taken into consideration in Texas. And so we always get caught in a spot and we don't have backup generation. And then what happens is people turn around and point to natural gas as being the problem. And it's like this kind of vicious cycle, renewables will fail because it's intermittent. And then you don't have backup power generation because we haven't invested dollars into that. And then people are like, oh, well, it's actually nat gas that's putting us in this problem. There, peaker plants can't keep up, and we gotta get over that infighting and actually figure out how do you have a reliable grid with all power sources.
Yeah. No, and it also shouldn't be lost when we're talking about renewable projects. Robert Smith and I talked on the podcast. I forget when he came on, but call it 6 to 8 months ago, I think.
Yeah.
He came on and said, don't forget that renewables are heavily dependent on project finance at low interest rates. And interest rates have probably doubled since he came on the podcast. And so you've got to factor that into the economics too. Because I mean, 80% of the capex at 2%, interest is a lot different than 60% of the capex at 5% interest. Changes the economics to things. And so, so yet to be seen how this plays out. I mean, the problem we still have is China and India building coal plants. I mean, we've got to figure out a way to address that.
I just don't think China gives a shit, no matter what people online say. I just don't think China cares about climate change. I think they care about economic prosperity and having power. So,
well, they always add 10 years. If we're going to go carbon neutral in 2050, they're 2060. And I bet if we went to,
we go
2057, they'd be 2067. Yeah.
So shout out to Jeffrey Bernstein. He said he loves the podcast. Appreciate you checking out the show. And Goldman asked, what the hell does wet behind the ears mean? I actually don't know what it means. I just know that
it means you're young and inexperienced, but I don't get what I don't know what that means. Or when you're born?
That's why I've always thought it's when you're born. I don't know. Well, you don't know anything.
So this is for GW2. The saying, mind your P's and Q's. Nobody actually, it means watch your manners, but nobody actually knows what the P's and Q's
mean. What are
the
P's and Q's?
Yeah. There's a thought that it's please and thank you Q's. Thank yous. Yeah. There's a thought that's that.
Yeah.
There's also there's a mind your pints and quarts, but nobody actually knows. So there you go. All right, let's do this. So I leave to go to Europe and oil is at $104 a barrel. Last week I get back, it's in the high 80s. A lot of what's driven that is talk of the recession, as well as there's just some weird EIA data coming out about gasoline demand. And Rory Johnson, who came on the podcast when I did the energy policy draft, he's a Canadian economist. He had a really cool take. His draft was he was going to buy the SPR, and when the curve was in backwardation, he was going to sell barrels and then buy them in year 3. It was in contango. He was going to buy current barrels and sell them into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought if he had the SPR, it was big enough that he could flatten oil prices forever doing that, or at least keep them, So anyway, he had an interesting take. But anyway, he did an interesting Twitter thread on this. And so what you're seeing is basically the EIA does this thing called product supplied. And it appears that product supply has dropped dramatically in July, literally showing less than kind of mid 2020 type numbers when we were in the heart of the pandemic.
Do we believe that?
Well, here are the two issues that he points out. One, weekly data versus monthly data is always crappier. So, and the other thing that happens is the weekly data doesn't get corrected. So if they publish, July, the second week, 2020 of 10, and in hindsight, it was actually 7, they never go back and correct it and say it was 7. So he says that part of it is the weekly, monthly, and they were overestimating stuff in the middle of 2020, and they're probably underestimating stuff today. He also talked about how we've had 50 some odd days of declining oil prices. And really what the definition of product supplied is in effect, you can oversimplify it, and it's gasoline station owners buying inventory.
Mm-hmm.
If prices are falling every day, you're waiting until the last absolute second to buy gasoline. And you might even go a week without having gasoline just because it keeps falling, because you don't want to buy today and then in a week you're selling stuff at a loss, because gasoline margins are, gas station margins are like 1% and 2%.
Yeah.
So his take from looking through all that is, yes, the data looks bad, but when you go weekly, monthly, range of errors, and then you factor in just the declining prices and people slow to buy, he said we're probably seeing a ding to demand, but it's nowhere near what the market thinks it is right now. And so that's why you've seen oil prices fall down. But I would go to Rory's Twitter feed and read his tweet on it, because it was a thread and it's a really good one.
Yeah, I mean, just anecdotal evidence. I mean, people are still traveling. You were traveling. We've talked about this on this show, and but I mean, people are paying attention to. Did you see that picture I posted the other day about the? John took a picture, and there's a piece of paper on a telephone pole here in Houston, and it said save 50% on your electricity bill, and had like little tear sheets to take a number. And I was like, that's when people are energy prices are getting high. You got the scams out on the telephone poles. So people are definitely paying attention to it, and I'm sure that's going to lead to some element of demand destruction. But so John Mink over at Nick Energy, he said China's in their industrial age, and they'll get there here in a few generations, 2 generations. Also said that the EIA data is good at a 5,000 foot view only, and I think that we could probably all agree on that. I mean, if you go run EIA data compared to some of the production analytics tools in oil and gas, I'm sure it doesn't line up.
So I thought you were going to go all tinfoil hat on me and say that Biden was distorting the data coming into the midterms.
I was just setting you up for it to see if you would go for it, because there are some people that think that data is being manipulated to tell a story. And I mean, look, data doesn't lie, but humans do. So I wouldn't be surprised if stuff like that happens behind the scenes, but I'm not going to go all tinfoil hat today.
The one thing I will say that I think is a little different than perception is people always believe kind of the spot price is actual supply and demand at that moment. I don't think so. It's a little more forward looking than it gets credit for. I mean, if you knew oil prices were going to go up $10 next week, would you sit there and fill your car up with as much gas as you could? Sure. If you knew it was going to go down $10, would you wait? Probably so. It's supply and demand at the moment is a little more forward looking than people think.
I don't know. Here's my thing about forward price curves is that it's astrology for finance bros. So I don't think it's as accurate as a lot of people.
It is
like
the collective judgment of billions of dollars traded every day.
All right,
so
all right.
it may
it's
not
got some legitimacy.
it's not it's not right, but it's at least the best accepted.
Mike Umbro said that San Diego Airport had 2 million travelers in June, exceeding December 2019. So, I mean,
Yeah.
people are traveling. I mean, I'm watching people on Instagram. Everyone's flying everywhere. I'm like, fuck, I want to fly somewhere.
So the global numbers on air traffic is we're at about 90% of 2019. And we're probably limited beyond that because of people constraints. I mean, you see the number of flights getting canceled every weekend. It's 2,000 and 3,000, and it's people issues. All it takes is a slight amount of weather to cause any sort of problems.
I saw something the other day that said 25% of flights are being canceled right now.
Or delayed. It wouldn't surprise me if that number on delayed is right.
I wonder what that impact has on demand. That's got to, if they ever get that issue figured out and can get flights on time, then surely demand will come up with it. But we had an acquisition this morning too. I think is that our last story for today?
I think so. Devon bought Validus. I can't pronounce it. I've got a couple of friends over there. We'll call them V.
We can't pronounce any of these oil and gas companies.
I know anymore. It's all pharmaceutical sounding names, but anyway, V had bought the Eagle Ford, and I'm going to quote David Ramsden-Wood on this, from the oil company formerly known as Encana. Given that we can't pronounce stuff. So they paid $1.8 billion. Devon did for that. It's a cash offer. That's basically a double in, call it 12 to 13 months for Validus. This is Devon again. They did what they call a highly complementary acquisition. They did one in the Bakken. Now they're doing one in the Eagle Ford. Their story is it's 2 times cash flow. And this is a great stat, and I got to give a hat tip to David Heikkinen, because he's the one that pointed this out on Twitter. But when Devon and WPX merged, it was announced in late September of 2020. Their market cap of their equity was about $6 billion. Mm-hmm. The two companies together, the deal closed in December 31st, 2021. Since that time,
December 2021, or was that 2020?
September 2020 was announcement. It closed December 31st of 2020. Sorry. Gotcha. Yeah, I blew that. Since that time, they've distributed $6.2 billion. So they've distributed more cash than the market value of those two companies. So for all the ranting we want to do about oil and gas companies being bad fiduciaries, at least
that's a pretty insane stat to think about. I mean, it kind of shows the velocity that the industry turned around over the last 2 years. I mean, 2.5 years ago, I mean, people thought oil and gas was dead, right?
Well, you know what it shows? $100 oil makes it really easy. That's what it shows. I mean,
look, it's easy to look smart in $100 oil, right? And it's easy to fail in low price environments when you're at $30 to negative $37. So that's just wild to think about, though, the combined value market cap of those companies. They've distributed that in dividends.
Sky Callantine, I mean, he's Felix 1, Felix 2. This is, I think, at least his third take on it. And dude hits the ball out of the park every time.
It's impressive. It's hard to do in this business.
Yeah, so. No, it really is. Really is. One other interesting thing that I read today. We are at August 9th. We've had 3 named storms so far, but none have risen to the hurricane level. So we haven't had...
That's been really quiet this year.
Yeah, we haven't had a no hurricane. Now, they always say that Labor Day is the start of major hurricane season, but just early on, no hurricanes so far, which hadn't happened in a long time.
Yeah, especially over the last, 5 years, it's been pretty tough hurricane season. So we deserve a break. That'll be good.
That'll be nice.
All right. Well, today, ending the show, this is the first week ever we don't have a finger of the week. I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah, I don't either.
Chuck came back from Europe and he got soft and couldn't figure out.
There's no hate in my heart. It's all good. No, I mean, I didn't really see anything, because usually we avoid politics. We just try to use it to point out the hypocrisy.
We avoid politics, but
we give it to politicians. But we point out the hypocrisy of someone trashing the energy business.
Yeah.
And I just didn't see one. So maybe if there's one I missed out there, if you'll tweet it out, I'll create the video and send it out on Twitter and LinkedIn and everything.
All right. Well, hopefully next week we'll return with some fire. And we'll have our
fire in the belly.
Yeah. But appreciate everyone that hopped in on the live with us today. Always appreciate you guys dropping in the chat and hanging out with me and Chuck, leaving comments. We'll be back next week. Tuesday, 10:30 a.m. Central, and you can catch the replay on YouTube. So share it with some
YouTube and anywhere else you get podcasts. It's the Spotify, audio Apple, versions on Apple, Spotify. Yeah. So
we'll catch you guys next week.